All right, so last time in my video, I showed you how to pin your pieces together using pins with a flat head on one end and a pointy end on the other. And I showed you how to thread a needle. These are just kind of your sewing machine or sewing basics. So I've got a double knot at the end of this, and then this is my needle. It's got a hole in it. I've put the thread through it. When you're beginning, you want a pretty big hole to put your needle through, or to put your thread through in your needle. Once you've been sewing for a while, it's a lot easier to do a smaller needle. So I wanted to show you just how to quickly do a basic seam. And now if you have sewed before and you've played around with it, a lot of times kids tell me, oh, I know how to sew. And then what they do is something called either a running stitch or a gathering stitch. And it looks like going up into your fabric and then down and then up and down and up and down. And what happens, let me see if I can real quick just do it on this. So you go up, then you go down, and generally you're not putting them real close together, and then you go up, and then you go down. And yeah, that will hold your stuff together for at least a little bit. But if you notice, as I pull it tight, my fabric is starting to pull together. And that's not a really good thing to do if I want I can just pull on it and it bunches up like that. Imagine trying to sew a quilt or sew a piece of clothing like that. It's not going to work out real well. So I'm going to show you a stitch called Backstitch. And Backstitch actually has one more step to it. It's really simple. This is what I'm reknotting my thread because I cut the end off. This is what people would have been sewing with in days when they were making freedom quilts, or if you learned about Little House on the Prairie last year, they would have been using that. So here's how we do it. I like to start when I'm doing a back stitch with coming down into my fabric with the needle. So I come down, I reach my hand around and pull the thread all the way through. So now I've got the knot sticking up. And what I'm going to do, I've got this line on my fabric. If you are sewing something, it's always good, especially when you're just starting out, to put a line to know where to put your stitches. And I'm going to come up a little bit further away. I'm coming up from the bottom, and I'm kind of using my finger as a guide. I'm putting my finger on the back right along where that line is so that I know what I'm doing. And now instead of going forward, this is why we call it back stitch, I'm going to go back to my knot and pull down. And then to do another stitch, see if you can see it a little better. Do another stitch, I'm going to come up on my line from underneath, and I'm just feeling around with my needle. You're going to have to be really, really careful because it can poke your finger, and you can kind of flip it over and be able to tell too. And then instead of going forward, I'm going to go back down to the end of my last stitch, and then I'm going to do it again. So guess what? I'm going to come up a little bit further away. I've been doing this for so many years that I don't need to look, but if I flip it over, I can see the line I'm starting to make here. So I can put my needle down, pull it through, then flip it over, and go back to the end of the last stitch. I find that hard now that I've been sewing for a while because you're flipping a lot. But if I wanted to double check to figure out where to put my next stitch, I've got a line going this way, so I'm just going to continue it. I'm going to put my needle down a little bit further away, flip it over, and go back to the end of my last stitch. And if I pull on my thread now, it doesn't do anything. Like that seam still stays really, really strong. So I'm going to sew to the end of the line here just so you can see what to do next. So I'm just going up a little bit further away and then down to the end of the last stitch. Coming up a little bit further away, and then down to the end of the last stitch. Sometimes you'll get a knot, or you'll get, what happens a lot of times with kids when they're first learning to sew, is that you get a loop here and you put your needle through it. If that happens, you might be able to just kind of pull your needle back out. If you get a really big knot, there is absolutely no shame in cutting your thread and starting all over again. So I'm getting up to the end of this. And then I have some options. I can either turn the corner and keep sewing on this line here, or I can do what I'm about to do and just cut my thread off when I finish the stitch. And I just drop my needle, so you can just kind of follow it around if that happens. This is a really, really handy thing to know how to do. I always tell the kids at the beginning of the year when we do this project, or at the beginning of the project, that it may seem like a girly thing to do. It may seem like something you don't need to know how to do. But when I was in college, I used to make a ton of money because I knew how to sew. And everybody that was in the choir had to get their choir uniforms adjusted, like hemmed or sewed or whatever. And so I would make like, I don't know, $10 or $15 every pair of pants that I hemmed. So now that I've gotten my stitch done, I can take out my pin and put it back in my pin cushion or wherever I'm keeping my pins so that it doesn't end up in anybody's foot. And then this is the seam I've created right here. You can see that orange stitching just a little bit. And on the back, it looks like a solid line. So that's what you want. So that is how to hem or how to sew a backstitch seam. I can cut off my thread here, or I can turn the corner and keep going. I recommend for beginners that you cut it off. And you can either get rid of your extra thread, or what I like to do, just put it in my pin cushion so I know how to find it for later. If you have any questions, if you feel like you really want to try this, this is actually a really cool thing. I've been actually hand sewing. I've been making masks for people, and this has been something I've been able to use some of my hand sewing skills with, because there's some parts of the mask that are easier to hand sew. So one of those things that I never really thought would come in that handy, but it's turned out to be a really cool way to bless people. And I've made so many things just by being able to sew for people that are gifts or whatever. So definitely a skill I recommend that you spend some time and learn how to do. And again, if you have any questions, I am more than happy to talk about how to sew with you guys. That's what I'm here for. So have fun. This is just your basic tutorial, and we'll see if we need to add any more skills later on.